Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today we are joined by Vice President of Practice and Field Advancement, Alin Bennett, and Senior Partner for Ecosystem Growth and Advancement, Bobbi Macdonald from Education Reimagined. Alin is a staunch advocate for national school transformation and creating an equitable education system. His previous work has included supporting curriculum development, leading advisories, and leading schools in ways that continuously advance learner-centered, equity-based practices. Bobbi is a social entrepreneur who believes in joyful work that illuminates the wisdom of communities, the importance of honoring the unique gift of every child, and the significance of centering relationships and belonging. Through her previous work as Executive Director of City Neighbors Foundation, Bobbi sought to provide an answer to the question, what would it take for every student to be known, loved, and inspired? A question that remains at the heart of her work today. Today, we explore an innovative approach that Education Reimagined is implementing to create more equitable and engaging learning environments. We discuss the importance of understanding your student and the role of the community in their growth. We dive deep into learner-centered classroom approaches and break down what it means to truly learn and how our schools can truly foster positive change to support student growth. Now to my conversation with Alin Bennett and Bobbi Macdonald. Alin, Bobbi, so great to have you both on the show here today. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited about today's conversation. There's so many directions that this is going to be able to go in, and we're going to do our best to keep it kind of in that 50 to 1 hour time constraint. I know that it's going to be really hard, but we're in it together. We're going to do it. But to kind of kick things off, I'm always wanting to know, how are you feeling today? And Alin, we'll start off with you. How are you feeling? How have you been over the last couple of weeks?
It's really good. It's been a busy time at Education Reimagined, but I am enjoying the summer with my two young children and sort of really getting to that balance. So a lot of staycation stuff so far this summer and a couple coming up. But it's been a gorgeous summer here in New England. So just really grateful for it and grateful to be on this podcast with you, Jordan. And I really appreciate the invite.
Awesome. And, the undervalued staycation. People always think, our summer vacations, we got to be on the road now. Staycation is something that more people need to lean into. Enjoy the place that you are, and I'm excited and happy to hear that you're getting to do that with your family. But Bobbi, we're going to toss the same question over to you. How are things been going for you over the last couple of weeks?
Going great. We're doing a lot of work right now at Education Reimagined and really connecting with our partners. And then, I'm here in New England as well. My husband and I have been exploring all the different little towns up along the East Coast. We went up to Ipswich the other day and checked out the bird sanctuary and an old antique car show, and definitely staycation is happening right here.
I love it. And for any of our West Coast listeners, I think that's the call to action. You got to maybe not do the staycation, maybe hit the road and get over to New England and go check out Ipswich, a little bit. I think, there is a lot of hidden gems in the New England area, and we're really excited to have both of you joining us here today on the show. To kick things off, I'm really curious, Alin, can you just share with us a little bit about your background in education and the journey that you've taken to get to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. And so education is actually a second career for me. Or maybe better put, it is a rediscovery of something that I was really passionate about as a young person and a young adult. And it sort of was steered away from the field a little bit in high school and in college. But I soon rediscovered that after working a couple of years doing web page design, graphic arts. And so I went to two universities, Rhode Island College to start off with, and then I had the opportunity through a Fulbright grant to go to the United Kingdom and work in the Lancashire County, particularly in Lancaster, UK. And I just had the benefit of immediately being immersed in what I would call a learner-centered environment as my first gig in education. So it was the Skirton Community School. Unfortunately, no longer operates, but it was just a really learner-centered environment that was doing really transformative things in education. And so I spent a couple of years there working on curriculum and helping them de-anglicize, very Anglo-centric curriculum. And so when my Fulbright was over, I had the opportunity to come back home to Rhode Island. And I ironically discovered a really transformative learning environment called the Met School here in Providence, Rhode Island. It's been in existence for almost 15 or 20 years, and it was right in my backyard and didn't even know it was exist. And ironically, my flatmate who was from the Netherlands told me about it. So I had to learn about something in my backyard from someone from on the other side of the Atlantic. And so after my Fulbright was up, I transitioned and I did everything at the Met School in Providence, Rhode Island. I started out as a volunteer. And then I went on to become an advisor, which is sort of a generalist educator in the Big Picture Learning Network. And so I took a group of 16 amazing young people on a 4-year journey together, where we grew and learned together. And after I graduated that group, I was offered a principalship in the building in which I served. And so I served as a principal at the Met School for just about 8 years. And then I wrapped up my time at the Met School in Providence, Rhode Island, helping support the larger district, because the Met School is a state public district and anyone in the state of Rhode Island can attend it. So I did some district work and supported them in my last couple of years. And then during the pandemic hit, and I think a lot of us asked sort of what do we wanted to do with our career and how can we have a bigger impact and a bigger change. And I'd already started doing some work with Education Reimagined as a consultant, doing some program leadership and helping facilitate meetings, Education Reimagined. And about 2 years ago, Kelly Young, our co-founder and president emeritus, asked me to join the team full time, which was just a blessing. It was very much aligned with my 3 previous careers, and so they have the same values and really were committed to learner-centered education being available to every single child in the way that I was passionate about working with the Met School and with Picture Learning.
Right.
It was a natural transition for me, and I've been there for almost 3 years now.
Amazing. And Alin, I just love that through line of growing and learning together. I think it's going to come out a lot in our conversation today about your philosophy towards education and how you're supporting learner-centered environments. And I'm really excited to dive in a little bit more into that in a few minutes. But Bobbi, first, same sort of question. Talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came to join the team at Education Reimagined.
Sure. Yeah. I started as an early childhood educator. I had a work-study job at the University of Illinois Child Development Lab. And that lab was a constructivist lab. It was really investigating how do children think and what are their ideas? And how do we as facilitators and teachers create an environment where their ideas are that they matter and that they can go deeper and deeper into discovery. And so that was really my first introduction to teaching, was from that kind of perspective. And I really, really loved that work. I loved being so interested in what the kids were thinking about and what they were discovering. And so that was, it became a full-time job for me. And then I went on to University of Maryland and got a master's in curriculum and instruction. And again, I worked at their lab school with early childhood and kindergarten kids, and with that same concept of children learning through play, the teacher and the environment facilitating their learning. And it was wonderful to work with student teachers and to supervise them. And it was just all about discovery and being part of a learning community. And then I also worked in Baltimore with Head Start and Children's Literacy Initiative, and I really got immersed in working with families and thinking with families about creating environments for kids to do that early reading and early literacy, which was wonderful. And then had the opportunity to co-found and design and operate a network of public charter schools there in Baltimore called City Neighbors. And we designed those schools based on 2 questions. If you could have the best school you could imagine, what would it be? And we went through kind of a grassroots process of answering that question together. And it really became the idea that the school would always be asking and answering that question together. And then when we got, so we opened 2K to 8. So when we got to the high school, we said, what would it take for every student to be known, loved, and inspired? And then we started designing around that question. And so for me, it was like a very natural progression then to connect with Education Reimagined. And I connected with them during that work as well when they were first forming. But now I've come over, as a full-time position, working to help catalyze invention of the kind of systems that would let schools like that really thrive. So that's my journey. And it's been just a wonderful opportunity to work with so many wonderful children, with teachers, with community partners. I feel very blessed and lucky in my work.
It's so inspiring, Bobbi, hearing how your previous work brought out two questions that, on paper are pretty simple questions to ask, right? How can you imagine the school to be the best that it is, and how are your students going to be present in their learning? And I just think, for those that are listening, we're 6-7 minutes into our conversation so far. And if you can start asking yourself those questions every single day and start thinking about how you can bring that into your strategic planning and your staff support, I think you're probably going to see some really cool things begin to happen in your buildings in the next week, in the next month, and in the next year. And it's really inspiring, Bobbi, that and those questions sort of led you to where you are today. But I'm really curious, and I know the listeners are here as well. And Alin, we can kind of start off with you. Just give us a picture, give us an understanding about what Education Reimagined is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Education Reimagined actually was born out of a conversation held by an organization called Convergence. And Convergence is sort of a think tank located in Washington, D.C., that brings together people with different commitments and needs and worldviews around big, important issues, brings them together to come to consensus and reimagine a world where we can all be committed to something similar and all move in regards to in a coalition sort of way. And so that conversation was really connected to education, the held by Convergence. And the question they asked is, if we let go of what was handed to us by the legacy education system, what would we create for our young people, for our families, for our communities right now, for the needs of there? And so that was an 18-month, if not longer, process. Bobbi Macdonald was actually my colleague Bobbi was actually in that early conversation, and they came up with this learner-centered vision. And I think Bobbi will talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it was this vision that saw learners learning and the purpose of education in a new way, and really reimagined what was possible for our education and for our communities and for our young people. And so Education Reimagined eventually formed its own nonprofit to tackle that work and continue the work of that initial inquiry by Convergence. And so from that vision came our mission and our commitment at Education Reimagined, and that is for learner-centered education to be available to each and every child in the United States, regardless of circumstance. And so that is our mission, making learner-centered education available to each and every person. And we do that in several ways. And so we like to think we have 3 buckets of work that we engage in. We have one is building the learner-centered field. We live into the commitment that learner-centered education is actually a distinct field that is up to much different things than the wider education field. So we believe learner-centered education is a distinct field, and that is a field that we want to build. And in order to have that building of that field, we need shared language, we need shared understandings of what it means to be learner-centered, and we need community of practice of people who are up to similar things. And if you think about other fields in other industries and other sectors, there are usually unifying language, unifying understanding of that. So that is build the field where we do that work. The second is share the vision. And share the vision is really elevating the work of learner-centered environments across the country, across the world, really, that are doing this and showing the world that this isn't a boutique or a specialized thing that is only accessible and is only powerful for a certain group of people, that this is happening all over the world, and done with fidelity by thousands of folks across the world. And then lastly, we have our Catalyze Invention field. That's where Bobbi and I spend a lot of our time. And that is identifying learning environments, individuals, leaders, communities who are up to something different, who are inventing in structures, practices, and systems that allows learner-centered education to thrive. And doing what we can to catalyze that invention and support that to be expressed in localities. And we work in all three of those buckets in different ways. So we offer direct programming, for example, to help folks develop that shared language understanding. We call that our Learning Lab training, where we bring practitioners together to see that they, although they may be doing learner-centered differently, they are unified in something that brings them together in a distinct field. We also have resources that we share to help practitioners and systems leaders to move with more velocity towards learner-centered education. And then we directly work in partnership with communities to develop things like community of practice and other mechanisms to help them expand their work on a local level. And so we do everything from like light touch programming for folks who may be interested in what learner-centered education is, even through our vision document, through hour-long webinars, all the way to folks who are really deep into the work and helping them catalyze and expand that work. And so we work in that wide spectrum of different pieces.
And it's just been so impressive getting to know the two of you and the work that Education Reimagined is doing, because like you just mentioned, Alin, if you're somebody who is early in the stages of what is learner-centered education, or you have a vision and maybe you don't even know what it's called, but you're thinking about moving in the shift, you can support them. But maybe you've been doing this for 10 years and you're looking to reinvigorate how you can support them with that. So we'll make sure that in the show notes, people will have access to the work that you guys are doing so they can learn a little bit more and connect with you if that's applicable, because I think, you guys have so much to offer for people at various stages in this journey. But, to kind of take one step back before we take two steps forward, Bobbi, can you just help us define what is learner-centered education? And perhaps, what are some of the principles of a learner-centered education?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you do have to take a step back, because when we started doing this work and really allowing ourselves to think about it and to focus on learner-centered education, we realized that there are some foundational assumptions that learner-centered holds at its core. So, and the first one is just the central work of education is learning itself, not the delivery of education. And that learning is a natural process for all human beings, and it goes on all the time. No one needs to be forced to learn. We're all learning, and we learn through experience. And, so that's one of them. And another one is that education is done by and with the learner. It's not done to the learner or for the learner. And the role of adults is to partner, to encourage, to facilitate, not to dictate, force, or dominate the process. And so that's another assumption that we just really hold as a foundational belief. And then the next one is my absolute favorite, and that's just how we see kids. All learners are unique. They're capable, they're curious, they're wondrous. They're not seen as above or below some average, but as a unique person. And that's applied to every single child, inclusive of race, neurodiversity, gender identity, age, religion, everything. The potential of every child is seen as inexhaustible and as an opportunity for endless exploration. And, when you have the chance to see every child like that, the teaching and learning looks different than it was before, and learning happens when learners' interests, passions, and purpose are engaged. So education is not an attempt to force unique learners into a standardized curriculum with a standardized set of outcomes, because that creates so many problems. And that's not usually why any teacher has gotten into teaching in the first place.
Right.
That's really not what it's about.
That's a clap your hands, snap your fingers moment right there.
Okay, that's great. So the purpose of education is for each young person to discover who they are, their unique gifts and how to contribute those gifts meaningfully to the world. And so if you have that as the underlying assumptions, then you have to say, what should we be doing with our time? How will we organize ourselves? And we've seen sites all across, in this past decade, we have been finding learner-centered sites and learning with them. And we've found that there are like 5 main components. And the first one is that learner agency. At the heart of it, it's learning is the work of the learners, and learning is purposeful. And so every learner is intentionally supported to take more and more responsibility to own, direct, and determine their unique learning pathways. So, starting in pre-K or even before that, but going all the way up, push that idea all the way up through high school and beyond. And then ensuring that learning is socially embedded, that we learn in community. And I really do love that one and believe in that one so much, that we learn through constructing knowledge in partnership with the people around us, and that the community and the world is the place where we can do that. And then making learning experiences personalized, relevant, contextualized, like who your story is, who you are, what you bring on that very first day, all of that matters, and that we need to use that and honor that. And rather than somehow stripping it away or saying that belongs in out of school time or in other places. And then 2 more, making learning open walled, like let down the walls of the school building. The community and the world are the playground for learning. Learning isn't restricted to a single building or counted because it's assigned by a school. Learning is recognized as happening all the time with lots of people and all over the place. And that learning and those experiences can be thoughtfully organized and legitimized, leveraging the resources, wisdom of the people around us, and then finally making learning competency-based. And I know you're very familiar with that, Jordan, but
yes.
We're referring to learning environments focused on building learners' abilities to do things competently in real-world contexts. So we're not going to read about swimming. We're going to go for a swim, and so really, really honoring the interests and passions of kids. But competency-based is an opportunity for learners to demonstrate what they can do and know in ways that are a match for their unique goals, skills, and capacities. So all 5 of these elements are interconnected. They enable, reinforce, empower each other. And all 5, if we could fully express all 5 of those, that would be learner-centered education. And then I just want to add one quick thing, and that is, that diversity, inclusion, equity. If we believe if every person is unique and curious and wondrous, we naturally want to serve every child based on their strengths and needs, and to support them for who they are and their unique gifts and how they contribute those gifts. Then that journey of self-discovery best happens when a person has an authentic feeling of belonging and love. And we know those conditions don't occur on their own. So creating diverse, inclusive, beloved community is something that needs to be created and nurtured. And that work to steward diversity, inclusion, and equity is never done. So we always have to attempt.
Yeah.
It's like scaling that mountain with no peak. We're always climbing, and we do that together in community. So that was quick lowdown.
I mean, there's so many amazing things to pull out of the work that you guys are doing. And I think, starting off with the idea of building a culture in these buildings so that students feel safe and warm coming to a building where they know they're going to be nourished in their learning. I think a really amazing call out is, yes, that is critical work to do, but it isn't also something you do once and you forget about it and then maybe revisit it in 10 or 15 years. And it's an ongoing formative process where you need to be listening and you need to be learning. And I think, it pulls all the way back to sort of that statement you mentioned of, we're here because we want to nourish that learning happens all the time, wherever and whenever. And I think it's just a really beautiful sentiment. One thing that I'm really curious about, as you were walking us through those different elements that make up what learner-centered is, for somebody who's brand new to wanting to try these models out, shifting and implementing 5 new elements right away could be almost a daunting experience to head into. So what I'm really curious about is, you mentioned how they're all very interconnected together, but do you see some of these elements being used almost in isolation? So for example, perhaps I'm a building and I really want to promote learner agency, but have an open wall building. Like, could I implement just those elements without needing to implement all the elements?
I go ahead, Alin. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just lean into the interconnected and interdependent nature of what Bobbi shared of those 5 elements. And although we do have them as separate elements, it is really just a thought experiment. So we can witness those occurring in local learning environments and identify this is what we're seeing. We are seeing learners being agentic. We are seeing a socially embedded advisory. And so it's really a thought process, but it's really hard to advance each one of those in isolation of each other.
Right.
The swimming example that Bobbi elevated is, my daughter learned to swim at the Y when she was younger. I would have been a little disappointed if the swim instructor gave her a bubble test on the breaststroke at the end of her swim lessons. I wanted to see her in the pool showing she can swim competently. So that is a connection between, open walled learning in the YMCA and competency-based education. So it's really hard to separate the two. That being said, and I'll just speak for myself, Bob, I'd love to hear your thought on this. The 2 that are really cornerstones for me, and it's hard for me to maybe 1A and 1B, is agency, learner agency, socially embedded. And those 2 are almost, because it is hard to support in developing a learner's agency if you don't know them and love them well. And so that's why those socially embedded. And if you start with just knowing a child well, I think that just sets you up. And if you know a child well, and your intention is to make them more agentic, I think you're starting in the right place. So for me, those are the 2 starting places. Bobbi?
Yeah, I agree. I think if you start with how you see kids and that relationship, and you're creating, a community around that. Like I said, I think the teaching and learning will be different. Things won't make sense as they did before. So yes, I agree. Those are the 2 top ones that are the most impactful. Everything seems to flow from there.
And I love the idea of asking folks to start to question what they're doing. And, when I actually, a story about my journey, when I chose to complete a postgraduate degree and leave the classroom as a former elementary school teacher, a lot of it was because I had big questions on why we were doing certain things, but I didn't know how to get those answers. So I actually chose to go back to school to try to get some of those questions answered. And for me at the time, I actually left with more questions than I had answers. And I thought, that's where I need to align to an organization that's going to help me start to answer the questions for myself, but really so I can support other teachers who are like me, who may not know some of those answers. And I think it's a really good place to be, because we know that as professionals, as educators, if we're not willing to take a risk and try something new and be very safe, we're never going to move forward and progress. And for the listeners here, definitely go to the Education Reimagined webpage. You can Google them. We'll put the link in the show notes, because they have a really amazing map of the country where you can go and look up these elements. And you can see where across the country these elements are being celebrated, and check out some really interesting school profiles. So if you're really curious about this work, you'll actually be able to go and see schools that are perhaps located right around the corner from you doing this amazing work that you've never known was taking place right now. Again, tied to some of these amazing elements. But to kind of pull it back, Bobbi, you mentioned something a little bit ago, and you were speaking about learner agency and how you got to really promote that learner agency, but not just in your pre-K. It has to be a model K-12, and you really want those students to be the owner of that learning and the responsible for the learning. And it really had me thinking, we hear misconceptions about learner-centered classrooms, or we hear misconceptions about competency-based models pretty often. If I don't grade it, my students won't do it. Or how am I going to get the teacher buy-in if it's loose in structure? How are we, my pre-K to 3 students can't show their learning like that. So, what I guess what I'm asking is, what are some common misconceptions that you're both hearing? And Alin, we can kind of start off with you on this one, and we'll lay out and squash these misconceptions that you're hearing about learner-centered classrooms.
Yeah, and so there are a few, I think, that we hear all the time as we look to identify, partner with new environments and just discover who else is doing learner-centered education. We often get a lot of questions that could be seen as misconceptions. And I think one of the first ones is that learners are doing whatever they want, whenever they want. And they're sort of left there on their own. And while self-directed education has a lot of learner-centered components to it, it is something that we consider distinct from self-directed education. It is because, connected to that socially embedded design element, learning is inherently a social endeavor, and it needs to be done in trusted, deep partnership with peers and adults around you. So it is not kids doing whatever they want. It is setting up the conditions where they can display their agency and advocate for the type of learning that they want to go for, done in conversation and partnership with those peers and adults. And so it is not that there's often something we hear is that learners are doing whatever they want, whenever they want, and learner-centered education with a lack of structure. So there are deep, and depending on which environment you go to, and different models and expressions of learner-centered, the structures just look different. And so it's not an unstructured endeavor. It's just the structures look much different than the dominant conventional education system. The second big misconception is that this is for certain kids. Learner-centered education is for certain kids, and that's a wide variety. Well, this quote-unquote gifted, talented kid is way ahead. They should be allowed to go learn outside in the classroom and make their own curriculum. These type of kids aren't engaged in their learning. And so we need to do something different for them. And we stand wholeheartedly by our intention that this is for each and every child. And that's why we are committed for it to be accessible by each and every child. And so we just believe it is the most natural. It is the way that we are actually, the brain science says we learn best. And so this is for all people, not all kids, all people. So that is another misconception. And then sort of another one connected to that this is an individualistic endeavor, that you just have a kid on their own sort of navigating and doing their own work, when it is really a joint community-based process. And this is really an investment in young people, but is an investment in communities in general. And so when young people can see themselves as part of a wider community and that they can powerfully contribute to it now, like that can transform how a young people sees themselves, just their self-identity, but also where they see their place in community. And so when learner-centered education is expressed in an advanced way, we often see our learners just really have like an individual identity of themselves, but they also see themselves in a wider context and within a wider community. And then the last one that I could offer is people often conflate learner-centered education with personalized learning. And they are not the same thing. This is not the same thing as kids on a computer going through a playlist and sort of doing things at not a predetermined pace, a pace and choice moment. This is really not just about personalization, it's about contextualizing learning and making it relevant as well. And so those are some of the bigger ones. And Bobbi, if there's any others that you'd offer, those are some of the most common misconceptions that we see.
Alin, I'm hoping we can just vamp a little bit on the personalized versus student-centered, because as you just mentioned, they're vastly different. Would you be able to provide, a broader example of what a personalized learning situation could look like versus being more learner-centered, just so that we can really kind of put the distinction in place and frame that as we move forward?
Yeah, and I can sort of give a broad general sort of reflection on that. And often where we see personalized education expressed, it is still within the context of the dominant conventional paradigm, that there are a predetermined set of content and outcomes that we are looking to reach, and we have to find some way to get every kid to the same place. So it is in personalized education, the finish line is often the same as the finish line for education writ large. But what they're attempting to do is create multiple pathways for them to reach that other
right
that finish line. And in learner-centered education, it is really that last assumption is creating the conditions for learners to discover who they are, what they can contribute to the world, and what they can contribute meaningfully to the world, and what they need in the meantime to reach them. So that finish line is different for each and every child. And if the finish line different, then of course the pathway to that finish line is just going to be inherently different. And we see that expressed in different ways in different learner-centered models. And so an example I would give you from my old colleagues from Big Picture Learning is this idea of developing every learner has an individualized learning plan. So it's not just for folks who, for a certain kid. Every kid has an individualized learning plan because every child is on their own unique learning journey. And, you know, while there may be some shared outcomes, that is not the starting point for the design of the learner experience.
I appreciate the clarification. I think you did a really beautiful job carving out the distinction between the two. Where I become to get really curious is the role of the teacher in this environment. And Bobbi, you did mention it a little bit ago. How does the role of that teacher shift? And how are they there to help provide some balance and structure, but also really making sure that student choice and autonomy is brought into that learning pathway?
Yeah, it really is a shift for an educator, for a teacher. And, you know, I think a lot of great teachers try and do this at whatever level they can, even when they're in constrained conditions, you know. And, you know, I've had times in my teaching career where I kind of closed the door. And so I could teach the way I really thought I wanted to teach, you know, and be with the kids in that way, because I was in a school at that time that didn't value that. But just saying that for the role of the teacher then becomes that of, first of all, to really be in deep relationship with each child and knowing the children, and then creating the smaller kinds of groupings to make that happen. I mean, you have to have that small grouping so you can know each child, and creating structures to support those relationships. So the teacher becomes more of a facilitator, absolutely, and also becomes, in a way, helping children learn and understand about the way they learn, about the way they operate in groups and in collaboration. You know, you really help. It's like that metacognition becomes really important, because what you're doing is helping build their skills and their self-knowledge as they grow and become. And you know, kids screw up sometimes, and they go through different phases, and it's a developmental process. It's not all supposed to be perfect. So there's like an artistry to it and a craftsmanship for a teacher to recognize that for each child as well. So you know, and teachers can't do this alone. And that's why, as Alin mentioned, it's really important and great to have a community of adults who are working together and supporting kids based on what they need and where they're at developmentally. But that guided facilitation, that metacognition, and helping kids build their self-awareness, that becomes paramount once you make this commitment and you're in that paradigm of learner-centered education. Alin, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that was well covered.
Okay.
You know, Bobbi, the idea that learning is not always perfect resonates so heavily. And I just feel like it's so easy for a teacher when they're communicating learning to families or to advisors or to students, mentors, if they're in a work-based learning environment, whatever situation it is, when that communication begins to leave the classroom and go to the external stakeholders in the community, teachers want it to be perfect. Because for some reason, they feel like I'm being judged or assessed as the teacher on the quality of output my students are having to those stakeholders. And I just love how with this facilitation model, the teachers are open to really trust the process and not the product. And I think it becomes a really amazing way to say, hey, this is real learning. Like, real learning is not perfect. And I wonder how that communication to the adults in that student's world begins to happen. Like, if I'm a family, how do I start to understand this a little bit better? What's my reaction as a family when I go into the building and they say, we're now doing learner-centered environments? So how are you supporting, school teams in communicating this model to families?
Well, one thing that we've seen in the places that we're working is, and this is really nice for teachers to feel assured, when you have a learner standing up there, they are the ones presenting their work. They're able to talk about their learning journey. Here's what I started out with and the questions I had. Here's what I tried working on with my friends. We did this. I met with this person. I found a mentor in this. I reached out to that. Here's the work I created. Depending on how old they are, but it's basically that same idea of showing what they've learned and the process of learning. And when you start having learners doing that kind of sharing, it changes everything. It changes how the parents feel as they're listening, the pride they feel. It changes how the teacher feels judged because the teacher has been there facilitating that all along. You see, it changes the whole conversation.
Right.
So getting the kids in the driver's seat and actually helping them to present that learning is so helpful, that a lot of the things we're scared or worried about in our constraining system gets taken care of. But there also is advocacy that needs to happen. And teachers do need support. And we need to build the credibility of this learning and show the impact it has on kids. And we need to listen to kids on the impact it has on them. Teachers got into teaching because they wanted to make a difference. And if we want to create the environment where they can really help kids become even more deeply who they are, then we have to support our teachers, and really the teachers deserve the same. They deserve that same level of personalized, relevant, contextual learning.
Right. And I would double down on that. I would just say, if you are supporting educators, if you're supporting caregivers to really reflect on moments in their lives that they really learned something deeply, it wouldn't look like what happens in schools typically. If you asked an educator what was their most powerful learning experience, if it's the praxis test, I would be very surprised if one educator in the United States said that, right? And so it is really, if you really examine what deep learning looks like and give folks opportunity to reflect on that in their own way and to see how it matches with them, that can often cause people to think differently around how that impacts the children.
And I think, Alin, for all the leaders that are listening, you just gave them the next activity at their upcoming staff meeting. Like, take a moment at that next staff meeting, team retreat, whenever you're listening to this episode, and pose that question to your teams. Think back on a moment where true deep learning occurred and what did it look like? And then we want to bring joy into it. Joy is always a great way to reinvigorate. So get creative. How are you going to share your learning story to your group? Whether you're going to make a TikTok, a podcast, a skit, a drawing, get creative and tell your story. And you're going to quickly learn that it looked a lot different than what you've done. So really, really easy strategy to get that process underway. But Bobbi, you just mentioned a little bit ago, the conversation around learning begins to shift. And we know that this conversation in the buildings is shifting. How the caregivers are interacting with learning is shifting. But for a lot of teachers that are out there, a lot of district leaders, they still do have measurements to consider. We know that there is a measurement or an assessment of learning that has to be done and communicated. So, Alin, I'm curious, as these conversations begin to shift, what sort of assessment or measurement methods are you seeing being implemented, and how is this being done so that it's equitable for all the learners in the space?
Yeah, I definitely recall a conversation I had a few years ago with a colleague, Kim Carter, who just revealed the Greek root of assessment, or to assess, and it means to walk beside. So like the original word is to walk beside. And that just brought so many things up for me, that it is really, that makes it relational in aspect. And it is not something that, like, even when you think of the term walk beside, like, what does that do to your idea of a computerized test? Immediately, right? There's no computer that, well, I mean, not yet, that could walk beside a learner to really give them an accurate assessment. Who knows with AI where that could go, but currently, what is that? So it is really doing, relating to assessment in a way that is deeply individualized and contextualized for each and every learner. And that goes back to that competency-based part of design elements. So overall, it's an assessment that is a match for the learner's strengths, their needs, and their aspirations. And sometimes that may look like a traditional assessment. If a young learner wants to be an ASC certified mechanic, ASC has an assessment already designed for them that is going to help them get there. And it looks relatively conventional, but it also has some performance-based tasks in there as well. And so it is really going back to that foundational idea. Let's look at the child, the learner first, seeing what their strengths are, what their needs are, and what is the context of what you're assessing. If it is a writing assessment, then it may be natural that you're gauging the writing. It may make sense to do a written submission. But if it is like the swimming test example I gave you last time, then it may be better to do a performance-based assessment or a work-based assessment, or something that provides an industry credentialing at the end. And so I'll just lean back into that. Whatever is a better match for that unique context and circumstance for that young person.
As you're saying these things, it is so different than a lot of the experiences educators might have coming out of teachers college or working within the district supports. And, it just makes me really think of teachers who want to begin to go down this pathway, but might think this is more work than what I have available. And we know that gaining buy-in from teachers on these models is essential for it to be successful. And when you introduce new concepts, a lot of times it becomes a compliance or a checkbox. So, Bobbi, how might you support a school or a district in gaining some buy-in on these models that, at this point you guys have proven is going to really give a great experience to the students learning?
I think it is hard when you're in a constrained conditions, and also if you've just already been doing something else, but the place you can start is by creating opportunities to listen and engage with learners, right wherever you are. You can start with them and listen what's made a difference for them, hear what would make it even better, like raise those student voices, ask some compelling questions together. Find an opportunity to create a learner-centered experience in your current environment. Give yourself a chance to feel the power of that work. You might think now, it's going to be much more work, but it's such a different kind. It's such a different kind of engagement. Allow that opportunity for kids to have a project where they really are following their passions and they're able to make a difference, and then tell that story. Narrate that story in a public way in your classroom, in your school, in your community, because that is the kind of work that can set you on the path to that you want to be on, heading in the direction that you want to go. So start with what you have. You can start small, and we're going to continue to work in the field with partners all across to continue to create that learner-centered movement and create the environment where you have a lot more space to do that. But I say for teachers that are right now, faced with in that overwhelming kind of place where they feel like they can't, start with one thing you can.
I love the idea of listening to where teachers are at right now as a leader. And something that I find is occurring pretty often is when you take the opportunity to listen and hear what your teachers are doing, you quickly can realize that teachers are doing a lot of these elements. It's just not named. It's just not called. And Bobbi, as you were talking about that passion project, it made me just think of schools that are doing capstone projects with a student defense. All of our district partners who are leveraging Portraits of a Graduate and embedding the competency development K through to 12 across their system. You are doing this work. It's just not necessarily named or called out. So starting from that perspective is really, really critical to be able to start small but dream big. And Alin, I'm curious from your side what sort of advice you might give to leaders who are either looking to shift into more student-centered environments or perhaps are, again, struggling to gain a little bit of traction with it.
Yeah, I double up on one, the thing Bobbi said. Listen not only to your teachers, listen to all your stakeholders that are in your space. And there's no child that is too young to really get an empathetic interview with and really see what drives them, what motivates them, what conditions do they thrive in. So listening to multiple stakeholders, it really starts with creating that deep picture of possibility that is inclusive and is shared amongst multiple stakeholders. So that creating that space of possibility that is inclusive. And that type of deep empathetic listening in a very structured way that shows each stakeholder that they are truly being and authentically being listened to, sort of naturally puts people in a different stance around trying something new. Like, this person has listened to me. I can see that they've listened to me in the strategy that they're going to undertake based on this listening. And so they're much more willing to do that. So listen first is what I would tell a leader. Listen first and sort of make moves sort of after that based on that deep. And we just saw that happen really powerfully in Kentucky, for example. The entire state of Kentucky, KDE, spent 2 years listening to every single county and doing 2 years of deep empathetic interviews before they even developed a strategic plan. And even after listening that, it was, they didn't follow it up with a compliance mandate that you have to do these things that we're suggesting based on the thesis. Like, this is what you told us. This is some things you can try.
Right.
And so leaning into that sort of trying and experimental mindset that we are all learning together and growing together and helping create that context with those stakeholders after listening to them is another powerful strategy and to engage in. And then I guess the last thing I was saying is, like, as a leader, it is often your role to be bold and hold on to that bold vision. When those things, when the time becomes hard, just personally as a leader, as the steward of a vision, I think is one of the most important roles that folks can really engage and lean into. So also just a shout out to folks who are leading some of that tough work, because you are holding on to a very bold vision.
The idea that as a leader, you're going to listen, you're going to adapt and implement and personalize based on what you've heard. I mean, you're truly just beginning to now model the elements that are going to make this learner-centered education actually happen. And I think, that's a really critical first step, because now those teachers are going to be able to see really easily how I can start in my classroom as well by modeling these similar behaviors. From both of you, and Bobbi, we'll start off with you. Why do you see learner-centered education as the future of K-12 education and beyond?
Well, I would say that the it's a wonderful time right now. I know it's a difficult time, but it's also wonderful because we have a chance to really rethink and renew public education, and we can align it with not just our workforce and economy needs, which it was designed for in the first place, for the industrial age, but also with our needs as communities, our needs to be connected, and for kids, like also a holistic approach. And so it's got, right now, like never before, we have technology that can help us, like, for example, so that every child can have a portfolio online so they can own their own data and that data can go with them. We didn't have that, 30 years ago.
Right.
We might have had the idea, but it wasn't easy to do. But now we do have that. So, and what we need is leaders and children and teachers and stakeholders who are connected, who see themselves and each other as people that they can count on, that they can create beloved community with. I mean, this is a time where we need to get more connected than ever before, socially. So we need that social innovation. We need the economic, and we also need for our planet and, to have kids grow up feeling like the things they do make a difference and that they are leaders in our communities as well. So it's a wonderful time for this to really take hold and to be renewed and renew public education.
Alin?
Yeah, I'll give a very sort of personal response to this, and I'm channeling my two young kids right now. And the reason why it's, great conditions is the future, but just the general why, it is just a more humane way to treat children and treat young people and treat human beings. We trust a public system, or many of us trust a public system, to do some of the most formative work with our children for at least 13 years of their lives. And as society is changing, as our views of the world are changing, and how we engage with the world is changing, we are seeing that mismatch between how the conventional legacy system prepares our people for the world versus learner-centered ways. And we are seeing that show up in a lot of ways. Disengagement of our young people, struggling mental health of our young people, a lack of belief in the public education system in general by parents. And so we are seeing that dissonance between a system and what we wanted to do very powerfully now. And I just know personally, one of my kids is only four years into that 13-year journey, and it hurts me personally to know that they have another 9 years of going through a system that is a mismatch for the world that we want to prepare them for. And so I think that is becoming, I think it has been clear in many sectors like workforce development, in industry. I think they have seen the mismatch for a while now. I think that is becoming ever more apparent and becoming part of the general zeitgeist of our society, that they're saying, something is not working here. I think COVID definitely exacerbated and increased the velocity of that understanding or that awareness. But I just think what we're seeing in the results of that mismatch in system versus need is really showing up right now. And as Bobbi alluded to, through our shifts in paradigm and through very practical things like technology, we have never been more positioned for transformation than we are now.
This has been Bobbi and Alin, and we're talking all about rethinking and aligning education in the needs of our communities to be better connected, not only for our learners, but for all stakeholders tied within our system and our society. Bobbi and Alin, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today. What an amazing conversation. Again, check out the show notes so you can learn more about Education Reimagined and where you can find out all things learner-centered education. To both of you, we appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you to your audience. And reach out, educationreimagined.org, and reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
That was Vice President of Practice and Field Advancement, Alin Bennett, and Senior Partner for Ecosystem Growth and Advancement, Bobbi Macdonald, from Education Reimagined. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. Please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.